This is going to be the second part here where I finish this off. So basically we created this new function in our custom JS, and I added this part here in the init method to call that function. So in other words, here's what happens. We have added custom.js, so it runs after app init, which is the default stuff that they've already got built in. We don't want to edit that. Then we call our custom object, which we've created in the custom file up here. So var custom, and this creates it in the global space, so it's available to our app, which is, I'm calling this our app. So now that we've loaded this file, that becomes available to us, and then all of these things after this part, so where it says return, it's returning an object. An object here is opened with this curly brace. It's not a function because it's not preceded by function and then parentheses like this one. So this is actually going to return an object to this variable, which again we call them methods. If then in turn, this is one of the parameters, if one of the parameters is set to another function, that becomes a method because it runs a function. So in other words, we've returned an object with the init method and a do some stuff method, which they gave us as an example. So inside the init method, I've added the call to this function we've made up here. Now, this is actually a variable, but it's set to this function, so it will have the same effect. It will run this function. So first thing it'll do is it'll go out and it will use jQuery and select the placeholder ID we created inside of our inside of that little rectangle we made, and then it's going to output that to our console, the contents of this, and I'll show you what that looks like just for your own edification. So we've got this saved, we've got this called, it's calling the init method, not passing any parameters. As you can see, there's nothing inside the parentheses. It looks good to me. So we come back over to our example and we are going to run that, and here it is. So notice we got this object returned to us. That, you can see, is a div with the ID of placeholder. And when I hover over it, look at that, it's working. So it's actually the body of that thing. So that's great. That's our first step, is to get that placeholder item. So we're done with that. The next is to get some data. So one thing we could do is look at their data. I mean, they have a ton here, and we could see what they're doing. It turns out that if we search for the ID they're using here, so if we look at this, they're using an ID of site activities. So if we search for that in the script tab of the console here, and we search all files, and if you're using Chrome, it's actually a different method, so I'll have to show that to you. If we search for it, we can find where they're making the call to that activities. So here they're saying if site activities size isn't 0, meaning it exists on the page, that's all they're checking for there. Then let's set this variable, var activities, boom, and they set all this data. And you can see it's an array of arrays. It's a X plot and a Y plot. So we're actually going to copy that. And I'm actually going to have to prettify that. And what that means actually is in Firefox, I can just say open it here with Sublime so that it's already formatted. Actually, I've already done that, so let's go over and find it. And let's find activities, var activities. There it is. So I'm going to copy this. This is, come down here, copy that, and we'll go back over to our index.html and our custom, and we're going to define this as our next part. So this is our data. I'm going to line that up a little better just because. Okay, so there's that variable. So now we have the object, the placeholder, and we also have the data, which I'll output to the console as well. So if you want to see what that looks like, I've just simply, with this console log, you can add a comma and add more items, and it will just add them to the output. And so you can see what that looks like. Load that. Reference data not defined because, yeah, okay. So I called it data there, but I actually called it activities up here. So let's be consistent. We'll name it data because I want this to be a very generic. Now I'm spacing this out here so it looks the same It's not necessary. I just do that. It's a habit to make it a little bit more readable, maybe. I'm also going to do this. You actually technically don't need to do any of this, but in my opinion, it's just, I don't know, it's a style that I'm comfortable with. But basically, if you have a list of variables, you can separate them with a comma. So that's what I've done here, data. And now data is an array, and it has all these different data points in it. So now I've got placeholder data. So let's have a look. Boom. Here's our jQuery object that's returned, which actually has tons of information in it. This is all the stuff that's in it. We don't care about that right now. And then here is my object array, of arrays, of my data. Great. What's next to make this thing work? We have to send it some options. So first things first, let's just try to call it. Maybe options is actually just, I don't know. Maybe options is actually just optional. Oftentimes there are defaults, so we'll just try it out without it. So we're going to create this plot. We got our placeholder data, no options at this point, so I'm going to get rid of that and terminate that line. So I've got my variable plot here. Let's see what happens, just out of curiosity's sake. Alright, it doesn't like it. Plot's not a function. Okay, fair enough. So in that case, looks like we might need to use this method here, or we might actually need to load the plot code on the page, because we may not actually have it loaded by default. So we'll try this. We have no options. Alright, let's see what happens. I'm expecting a similar error. Yeah, not a function. Okay, so in other words, what that is telling us, plot is not a function, is that method is not available to us, which means that they have not by default loaded the I'm going to go back to the original format. They've not loaded the Flot plugin for us. So we have to do it. So we come back down here. Here's the plugins, Flot. So we got to make sure that we see these two JavaScript files loaded. So let's take a look here. Let's just look for Flot. In the sample page they gave us, of course, I wrote that. Okay, and that's the only Flot reference. So let's see how they do it in the page code from their example. So here it is. Let's see if Flot's referenced. And there it is. So they've added it. They've added the two references that we need. So we have to do that. All right. We'll go ahead and copy these two lines. And it looks like they have them before some things here, date range. I don't think it matters as long as it's after jQuery. So we'll come down here to where they're calling all of our different plugins. You can see they have all the plugins here. These are the core plugins. So we're going to add Flot. Boom. Now, see if we get a better result. Ah, something happened. Excellent. So that's good. So we're getting somewhere, right? The next step is we just need to figure out how to make it look right. So that's always critical. So I think what I've noticed while I'm doing this is we actually need to put the placeholder inside of here. So we'll do this. We'll go placeholder like that. And we're actually adding its own little place, and we're going to get rid of that. We'll just let that be the wrapper. So it goes inside the body of our portlet that we created. See if that has any improvement. Marginal. Okay, so it looks like we got to do something. Now, remember, from the beginning, I think I told you that this thing actually has to be given a fixed height and width, and that's one thing we haven't done yet. So how do we do that? We're going to use CSS. So coming over here, let's have a look and see how they actually did their height and width. So let's see if there's a height given to this. So I'm looking at my styling over here, and I'm clicking on the elements that wrap this to see if there are defined height and widths. I'm not seeing anything here. Let's see about this one. Height 100. So it turns out that they've set the height on this thing. So we're going to do the same. And the way that we do that is we use CSS. So in this case, we could use custom CSS. And you can see that we're already loading that. So the way we find that is, again, we go into our assets and we use CSS and we find custom, and the custom one again is the one we're going to edit, and you'll see there's nothing in there right now, so we're going to add our height to our placeholder. And if I can find it, there it is. So we're going to add height to this. So just like in jQuery, because jQuery uses the same sort of selectors, we go like this, oops, to identify our placeholder element, and then we say, let's make the height 100 pixels. Now, that will be called, let's go back to our example and take a look. Oh my gosh, we're getting somewhere. So, we're actually starting to see something happen, aren't we? Now, nothing's really panning out over here in the data, but we're actually starting to get a chart. So I'm actually going to go back to my element here and get rid of this placeholder text because it's unnecessary. I can just stay empty, and now when we load it, that won't be there. It's great. Now we actually have a chart. It's just not displaying stuff in the way we want, and that's where the options come in. Now the options they've used are actually quite complicated to make it look nice. Go figure. So if we look, here's their call to plot. You can see they're using the $plot. They're setting it to this variable called plot activities. We're just using plot. So they actually are highlighting the site activities. That's the object they're selecting, and they're going through and they're setting data to activities, and they're actually using an array to do all these different settings. So they're setting the color, they're setting shadow size, bars, and they're setting all this different information. So we could actually do the same thing. So if we wanted to, we would actually use the exact same setup. We'll just edit it for our purposes. So we copy, go back. They're using index.js, we're using custom.js. I think we're actually doing it right. Their example may have been on an older method before they developed that, so we're winning. So here's the expanded version. So that's what we had originally. I'm going to replace it with this and tab this out a little. Alright, looks good. And of course, instead of site activities, we're going to use our object we got up here, which is placeholder. So we've already got it. Placeholder. Boom. And instead of activities, we're going to call it data. And everything else should be the same. So let's have a look at our handiwork. Oh my god, victory. So notice again that we have no hover item, right? So we're not actually seeing anything hovering in there, but if we want that, we can get it. We can also adjust the height some on this thing. Again, through CSS, it's really easy. So if you want to adjust the height to, like, let's say 250, go like this, change it in the custom CSS, come back over here, refresh. My god, there it is. So you can see we're actually getting something out of this. The next step to add the labels on hover state is actually a lot. There's more JavaScript, so it's actually going to be a little more complicated. So we can discuss that at a separate time. But this is basically how you create your chart. So it seems complicated, and I know we've covered a lot, but we can rehash it. We basically covered like the whole gambit of JavaScript and CSS, and we've been doing a lot of crazy stuff, so I know that it's probably just a little confusing, but if you keep up with it, it will become more and more known and understandable. So happy to walk through it more with you, but for now, that's that. All right? Okay, talk to you soon. Good luck.